and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. We're in for a fantastic treat with Dr. Katherine Moore. She's the Mainwaring Teaching Specialist for the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials, CAAM, at the Penn Museum, consulting scholar in the American section, and a professor in the Anthropology Department. She received her Ph.D. from the University of Michigan, and her research interests include cultural ecology of animal production, pastoralist and hunter-gatherers, crop production and animal materials in South America, North America, and Central Asia. Her teaching interests include zooarchaeology, ethnoarchaeology, and the archaeology of food. Kate is also the co-curator of the exhibition Ancient Food and Flavor, currently on display at the Penn Museum. Before we begin tonight's lecture, I just want to take a moment to encourage you to join us next month when we'll hear from Dr. Simon Martin about his work in the Maya sites in Central America. During tonight's presentation, if you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that they get read at the end of the program. So let's go ahead and hear about the earliest hunters in the mountains of South America. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Tina. I'm pretty excited about this. Let me share my screen. And there we go. I'm really looking forward to seeing I am very excited to see the people who are on. Oh, this is not the one I want. Let me stop sharing. Let me go back to the file that I have here. I'm really excited to talk about the earliest hunters in the mountains of South America. And I hope that everyone who knows me knows that this is something that I've been working on for a long time. And I hope that people who don't know me can get excited about one of the most dramatic stories that actually archaeologists are working on right now in terms of things that aren't that far away in time, but are very, very challenging to think about because we know so little, and it's really hard for us to put all the elements together to figure out where we should start doing research, how we should start thinking about what we already know. So this is a map of South America just nipped from Google Earth. And I want to kind of draw your attention to the fact that there is that narrow strip of mountains.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, you're not sharing currently.
Oh dear. Let me start again. Do you see my slide?
We do not.
Okay. Let me go back to Zoom. Let me start from the beginning.
There we go.
Good. Okay. I hope everyone's still excited. This is exciting because the geography is really cool and because the extent of South America is so large, it's so diverse, and it has provided so many challenges. If you've thought a lot about the Amazon basin, you know that the Amazon basin provides enormous challenges in making a living and getting around and understanding the environment. Same thing is true for the Andes. It's very challenging in terms of the altitude and the cold and the lack of plant productivity, but there are places where life has been really good over many, many years. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to be talking about 3 sites tonight, sites where I've been working for, in one case for 40 years and for another case for about 10 years, and now the third one for a few months. And so that's very exciting to keep learning new things about different parts of South America. So I'll draw your attention to the fact that there's this band of the Andes on the western coast of South America. The pale edge represents how desertic it is when the rains from the Amazon get caught in the mountains and don't make it all the way to the Pacific. And so the mountains themselves, even though they're very, very high by standards of mountains in the United States, are well watered, and they are a really nice compromise between kind of wet, dry, and remember that we're right on the equator. The equator runs right across here. So everything that you think of about seasons, like how when things are cold, when days are short, are not true. That there is a much stronger, it's a truism that is sometimes is hard to grip. It is a truism that the biggest temperature changes at high altitude in the Andes are between noon and nighttime, that the differences between different times of year are quite minimal. So everything's about making it through the night. So here's a couple, these are maps from places that have been sort of, this is a way of exemplifying how exciting and active an area of research this is. This map is only 10 years old. One of the sites I'm going to be talking about is marked here as one of the really early sites. Ice Age occupations is kind of an extreme way to put it. We're really talking about the end of the Ice Age. Then there's a site called Cueva Bautista here, and then there are some quarries here. So you can see that there are claims made for very early occupations based on the archaeology that have been found in a number of places. Within there, we can use different kinds of archaeological data to show how people went back and forth between places. We can see how people were able to use the environment. For example, if you see this little Alca circle here, all the little black dots are places where people picked up obsidian, the beautiful black volcanic glass, and carried it to different places in early time periods. So it's very clear to see that people were clearly able to go back and forth, up and down the mountains, and they were able to go up and down these very, very steep, treacherous river valleys, which drop 5 miles in 2 miles. The new thing that has made this an even more exciting field of study is the fact that now there are an increasing amounts of genetic data to suggest the relatedness between the ancient peoples of South America and the ancient peoples of North America, known from their remains, and the genomic material taken from their remains. And so you can see, again, here's Cuncaicha, one of the sites I'm going to be talking about. The ancient people from Cuncaicha are connected biologically to people all the way here in the Northern Rockies, and by extension then all the way into Alaska and into Asia, so that we have a very clear connection at this time, and one that kind of constrains what we're talking about in terms of how much time is available. Some people have approached this from what the environments would have been like that those early hunters would have been able to depend on. So my colleague Lucho Barrero, for example, on the left-hand map, mapped all the places where there are extinct big animals, where humans, if they were living in these early Ice Age times, might have left traces of their preying upon, hunting or scavenging these big animals. There's absolutely no convincing evidence that this was the case. This constrains our understanding of how long ago this entrance to the New World, the Southern New World, was, based on those climate-based data. There are other anthropologists who are looking at what the bodies look like in terms of the physical traits, what the appearance, especially of the skull and the teeth were. And again, it's a fairly straightforward story, which constrains the process of getting to the New World through the Straits of Panama to a relatively narrow range. And it means that this is happening very quickly, and it means that it's happening in a very a way that really draws our attention in terms of how many things people would have had to bring with them in terms of their skills, their understanding, their technology, their ability to deal with the landscape. And from a demographic point of view, we can see that there is the early populations of the South America, the ones that we're talking about, those pioneering immigrants, later were somewhat overcome. Genes coming from Mesoamerica came, and this in later time periods, later than I'm talking about. The material I'm talking about tonight is like 13,000 years ago to about 11 or 10,000 years ago, these people who came and started replacing the earlier Paleo-Indian people in South America probably came with corn and some other Mesoamerican crops and practices. But we can connect and we can start using the similarity of genetics to be able to show how these people in these individual sites related to one another biologically, and then we can use the archaeology to be able to study how they related to one another culturally, in terms of technology, in terms of belief, and for all we know, in terms of their social organization. So how does this happen? How do we head out over these wide, not very fertile, not very cozy, but productive and knowable frontiers? This is my student, Katherine Moore, who accompanied me on the field trip that I took in 2016 to see this area in southern Peru for the first time. And you can kind of see there's a long, just the metaphor of this road stretching into the distance. How would you find your way from mountain peak to mountain peak, from watered valley to watered valley, all the way from, say, Wyoming to this area in the central South America? How would you do that in 2,000 or 3,000 years? So the story really starts in the middle of these three sites, at the site of Panaulauca, where I worked in the 1980s, did my doctoral work, and actually deep in my heart, never thought I would see again. So this is what it looked like back in 1982. You can see a classic Toyota Land Cruiser there that we went back and forth from a little herding village every night. You can see we've built a wall to hold the enormous amount of back dirt we were producing, and we'd rigged up a little cover so that we could work and keep the very fine-grained and precious archaeological sediment safe. We dug a lot of this cave and we learned a lot. I excavated and studied probably 2 million bones, of which about 1 million of them I have analyzed in detail. So on one level, I didn't think there was more detail that I needed from a site like this. And so it's a surprise about how the field of archaeology unrolls to be able to say, huh, okay, let's see what we can find. This is what the site looked like in 2019. You can see we have another, it was not a Toyota, but it was a very sturdy little SUV. There hasn't been anyone doing archaeology here for a long time. It was very interesting to see how the cave, after we'd filled it back in, had reverted to its original use of being a shelter for the people running animals through this valley. And in some cases, it was clear to see that there had, from the archaeological evidence, that people had camped there and maybe taken care of their animals, maybe done some inoculation of the herds that are kept in this area today. We're talking very high up. This area is about 4,100 meters, so it's about 1,450 feet above sea level, which is a challenge for most people who are at most people who aren't adapted to it, and is one of the reasons that people say, wow, this would have been a very tough environment, not the place where you'd start when you begin to learn a new environment. So this is the difference between then and now. We had made a decision, kind of a pragmatic decision, but it turned out to be very significant to me that we camped out instead of staying in the village. And I had never known the site the way I did when I was there 24 hours a day, to be able to see the sun come up, to see how the cave warmed, to see how protective and nurturing it seemed in the the bitter cold of the middle nights. We didn't go up there but a few times, but when you go in, you feel protected, and the empathy that I gained for what the early settlers in this region would have experienced was really bigger than I thought. This is a little video of taken by drone just this past summer that lets you see how wide and expansive these valleys are and how prominent and distinctive the topography of the cave is. There's archaeological deposit all the way around. Probably it's about 200 meters across from archaeological sediment to archaeological sediment around the mouth of the cave. Here we are going into the cave. You can kind of get a feeling for how effective a shelter would be if you didn't have the time or the technology to build a house. And then you can fly in your drone, you can fly right out and see a very commanding view of where the game are in this hillside. So here I am in 1982 at the bottom of a very deep trench. This, the smile on my face represents a sense of satisfaction that I had learned and dug the archaeological sediment from the very latest prehistoric material stuff that probably date to the Inca time period, all the way to the earliest people at high altitude in South America. So this was a great chance for me to test the archaeology of the 1980s and to have a sense that I could contribute to studying this very little understood problem of how people moved into this area and settled for the first time. The stratigraphy, the layers of soil being built up by repeated occupations of the cave are coherent, and that's an excellent thing for being able to compare to other sites and to compare the little place where I was standing was right there. And you're going to see that, in fact, when we went back to this cave, we decided that we were going to start right here and to go right through from a period that dates to about 6,000 years ago to a period that dates to about 11,000 years ago. From above, standing on the top of the cave, you can see that we opened up quite a bit of real estate in the 1980s and got a sense for how people mapped themselves across the site, how they stored stuff in pits, how they built little houses for themselves, and how the difference between the inside and the outside of the cave was clearly manifest. Clearly, they knew where the warm places were. When we went back 40 years later, my colleague Kurt Rademacher and I decided we needed to connect first with the material that already had been excavated. This is material that had been in a combination of museum and private hands. We reached out to the people who've been saving it for us, and there they were, boxes and boxes full of material that we were very glad to see, because we have a whole generation of new techniques, including more powerful radiocarbons dating using different materials, isotopic techniques that let us engage in understanding the ecology better, better ways to understand the source and the significance of the variation in the stone tool technology. So in fact, I was getting more and more excited about what we were going to be able to do if we had a chance to go back to the site. So our next step was to go back up into the mountains to meet with the local officials so that they knew who we were, what our goals were, and that we were meeting their standards for people in their community. Some of them were, ministers of culture and people like that. This guy was a tourism minister for the local authority. But we also met with landowners and people who we refer to as site stewards, people who live nearby, people who are keeping an eye on the landscape, keeping an eye on the people going near the caves, and taking personally the responsibility of making sure that the caves are protected and recognized for their cultural heritage. And this little guy with the hat on was so excited to have some more archaeologists. There had been archaeologists at this one cave 3 or 4 years before, and he was full of curiosity, full of pride at taking care of a site that was so important to understand this early period. So here we are back at Panaulauca. We seem like we're not taking good care of the landscape, but in fact, we were just unpacking at this moment. This was a very small crew, just 6 of us, and plans to move quite a bit of dirt and then take some very, very detailed samples. This was a very quick trip as well, compared to the 6-month field season, which was my last one in 1982. We were here for 7 days. So we started back in the floor of the cave. None of the dirt we were moving was in its original context. It was all back dirt that had been mixed at least twice in the time period that archaeologists had been working on it previously. And so we were just moving it out of the way in buckets. We had an idea based on my experience at having seen it back in 1982, which seemed longer and longer ago. As we went deep in the dirt, I was more and more confused by the amount of difference that amount of time made. It was very interesting, but we did go right down, and our friends came by. They wanted a video to talk about what we were doing so they could share it with the local community. We were working with the stone tools they'd collected from the slopes outside the site that were being exposed by erosion. And then in a period of only 4 days, We got down to the last widely exposed living floor, found the 1 by 1 meter trench that had been our deep sounding, pulled that dirt out, and identified the earliest occupation at the site without having disturbed a bit of the site's original stratigraphy. So there's some smiles there. So what was our plan? Our plan was to take very, very tiny samples, little chunks of dirt about the size of a pack of cards, wrap them up in plaster gauze to hold all of the soil and the sedimentolographic information together. Then they've already been shipped back to Germany. They have been embedded in resin, and slices are being taken to examine under the microscope to give a very, very fine-grained analysis of the buildup of the site with different kinds of behavior: burning, discard of cultural materials, erosion of the cave, wind, vegetation. How did all of these things affect the buildup of sediments, and how can we better understand the intensity of occupation in the early periods using those records? So we're busy piling up tiny little samples of dirt that we're taking out with them in conjunction with these larger samples that are being wrapped in plaster. And I removed about 42 bones from the exposed surface of this trench after it had been cleaned. I pulled them out. I documented their relationship to the original layers, to the samples, and analyzed them so that they're going to be ready for new radiocarbon dates. And we took about 100 samples for other kinds of soil manifestations, which we didn't know about back in 1982. But now we do, and now we want to tie it to the already massive amounts of information from the site. So the reason that we were so anxious to offer some comparison was that actually we had been working at another early cave site for a couple of years. And this is the work that I did under the aegis of the Paleo Andes project with my colleague Kurt Rademacher, now of Texas A&M University. And you can see that it's a really challenging environment. It's higher than Panaulauca by enough to make a difference. Snowing even in the dry season, and the glaciers, rings of glaciers all around. Really incredible environment. And you may think, could people have lived here at the end of the Ice Age? And the answer is yes. So here's the site on a slightly warmer day. It is a fractured cliff edge, which is casting down boulders. And you can see up there just the tiny little people. This is actually a pretty substantial slope. Again, this would have been a warm, sunny place to take shelter, and it offered an incredible view of the landscape around it. So here's the crew. This was, in this case, a bioarchaeology focused crew. That is, people who were interested in studying the relationship between humans, plants, animals, and the local flora and fauna, including extensive samples taken to understand the human remains that had come from this site. So there are people from all over the world here: Peruvians, a guy from Colombia, people from North America, people from Germany. Part of this was sponsored by the Max Planck Institute. So we're standing on the edge of the occupation, and the site's main deposits are behind this stone wall. Again, the stratigraphy was worked out in an early trench, and it's very coherent. It's very deep and old. The terminal Pleistocene down here means this material is like 10, 11, 12,000 years ago. And the difference is that the material on top, the long history of occupation in more recent times, isn't as deep. So we're a little bit closer to the early stuff when we start digging this cave site. I was very interested in the animal resources, both the llamas in the region, who are, you can see how happy they are in this dry, parched hillside, and then the alpacas, which hang out in these very important wetlands. Here's a stream making its slow way through these thick, peaty soils on the way to spill down to the Pacific in the end. This is a very important resource for modern herding peoples here, and it must have been an important resource for the hunting people. Animals would have flocked, to say nothing, to coin a term, here, especially in the dry season. And this is a very key part of our reconstruction of how people would have made a living, even though it's so cold. The dependence on animals would have been key. So you can see that this was tough work. Everyone was happy to get into our one tent where we had a table and a place to sit down. There was very, very intense efforts to take as many samples as we could under these tough circumstances and to do as much analysis as we could while we could, so we could offer feedback to the people who were doing the digging. We don't bring samples back in as a matter of course from these sites in the modern times. We can apply to take very small samples back for destructive analysis, but the main bulk of the analysis that we do happens in the home country, and the collections stay in a local museum. So here we are doing a technique called flotation, which I think a lot of people have heard about from various people at the Penn Museum. This is the highest altitude flotation ever done. This was water that froze overnight and had to be lifted off in a chunk of ice in the morning. This is Brent Furlett of the, he's actually from Northern Canada, so it suited him fine. He did incredible work. You can see him recovering micro artifacts and plant remains from these samples from Cuncaicha. Every day we did a counting of the more traditional artifacts, including these beautiful obsidian projectile points. You can see there's a few potsherds here. This is a tray of material that was recovered in a single day when we were just getting going in some of the later deposits. Every day we had a local site coordinator from the community come and take a picture of the things that were most kind of eye-catching, significant in terms of the time and activities in the cave. This was his job to keep track of us for the local community. They were not used to the work that we were doing. They didn't understand its significance. They didn't understand what they were going to get out of it. And we tried to be really, really good partners. They were actually became very interested in the archaeological process. Both our site supervisor here in the blue hat and his little toddler, who was going by the name of El Tigre. He came multiple days to really bask in the sunshine here. And we really appreciated their support and the degree to which they were a great liaison between us and the wider community. We made an offering to begin the material. So this is an approved offering from a witchcraft specialist that we met in the market. She put this material together, and then we burned it in a ritual fire at night as a way of showing everybody in the community that we really understood the magnitude and the import of what we were doing in opening the ground and finding things that had been in the ground for a long time. We provided them with a lot of resources for their school, but one of the things that we really wanted to do was connect with the people who lived in the community. And so we wrote this little book, The Cave of Cuncaicha and the History of People in the Puncucho Basin, and illustrated it with one of the girls on the crew was just incredible, Sophia Van Haller. She started sketching out the things that we were recovering, the way that we were learning about the landscape, and putting that together with the message of what we were able to offer the community in terms of understanding how important the work they were doing was in living and maintaining their environment, and how they came from a really proud and distinctive ancient tradition. So what did I find out with this work? So there were a couple of different food sources that were important in this region. I found out by analyzing the bones. Here are the vicuña, one of my favorite animals in the world. I have some video of vicuña in a minute. Here are the larger version of the camelids of South America, the guanaco. There is a deer, the taruca, and then there is the vizcacha, which lived in the cave while we were there. And a baby vizcacha is a very cute thing. They are related to the chinchilla. They look like kind of a cross between a rabbit and a monkey. They have a long curly tail. And in fact, their remains provided some moments of just not distress, but moments of puzzlement. And I had to work really hard on figuring out what the relationship between the vizcacha and the people really were. I knew what the relationship was between the vicuña remains and the guanaco remains and the deer remains in the cave. People had left the cave. obtained those animals and brought the bodies back. The Vizcacha, it was a little bit more complicated. So here are the vicuña. You can see that they are clearly camels, but they don't have big humps. They live in small groups. Their behavior is very obvious because they live, well, let's watch it one more time. They live in, they're most active during the day, and they're tethered to water. And so the relationship between people and water has a lot to do with the relationship between vicuña and water when we look at these specialists. So to pick apart the vicuña versus guanaco story, I found their toe bones. And you can see that this is a picture of a beautiful whole toe bone right on a page of notes where I was recording everything I could, because there's a lot of information, the size of the bone, whether or not there was evidence for a little bit of inflammation here. And then I was looking very hard for little evidences that there were cut marks, because when people are sitting there skinning out tiny toe bones, they are really taking their time. They are working the animal over, and they are getting every bit of food out of them. And they're probably making a pretty fine fuzzy skin. So my work with the numbers involved was that there were about 6 to 8 vicuña for every 1 guanaco in the early times, which means that the vicuña and the water that they needed must have been an important connection between the people and the land. When they could get a guanaco, even if it was a baby guanaco, they would take it, but their adaptation was based on their access to the vicuña. So then I try to do the tricky stuff where I go in a little deeper and try to see what the relationship is between the marks and shapes of the marks on the bones and what kind of food and behavior data I can get out of this. So up here is a toe bone, the middle toe bone, the knuckle bone that you would have right here would be the little hoof. And you can see there very clearly there is a crack there and another crack there that opened up the bone. Now, you're not going to crack open a bone to suck out the marrow unless you really need that food. That's a hard, having done it myself, I can tell you that it is a tricky task. And these people were making very complete use of the animal. My supposition is that they are eating one animal at a time, going from nose to tail, and taking every bit of nutrients and resources from it before they go on to the next one. This is the bone here. This is the hyoid, which supports the tongue. And these little cut marks mean that when the bone was very fresh, someone went into the jaw and pulled out the tongue. So that's kind of another dish, another way of approaching this animal. To get at the tongue, they would take these jaw bones, and this is a pair, this is the same animal. And after they had cut the jaw off on both sides and pulled it out, they would have had access to the tongue. Then we talk a lot about what kind of cooking, especially in a cold environment, this would have meant. And when you look at this bone, you can see that the tip was burned, and then the skin shrunk back as it was in the fire and exposed a little bit more to the bone to the heat, and then it shrunk back to expose that. So this is we talk about this, but we don't actually see this very often. This is people grilling meat. They're putting it over an open fire and enjoying probably the very first couple of meals that would have come from these animals. The toe bone might have been the 14th or the 15th meal, the tongue, in the first couple, but this is a very early stage. So I'm always mindful of how I can understand people using individual animals, since individual animals would have been the way that they would have learned about, they would have learned about the individual animals, individual groups, their individual territories on near which water sources they would have gone into, kill probably with a thrown spear, one animal at a time. You can really see them make their move and keep warm and well fed in this environment. So this is for Marie-Claude Boileau, who helped me do this work. This I needed because I was so interested in getting molecular information, DNA and isotopes out of these bones. I needed to be able to prove how well preserved they were. This is one of the issues when you're working at stuff that's just at the edge of detectability, that you need to know that you're working with the highest quality samples. So if you look at this microscopic thin section, you can see that the clusters of bone cells that run like tubes through the bone are really well preserved. And so that's good. That's like at the cellular level, the bones are looking good. Under cross-polarized light, you can see that the bright rings that you see, that's biorefringence, shows that the collagen, the protein portion of the bone, is well preserved. This is a beautiful, beautiful piece of bone. And if you don't think it's beautiful, then you haven't been to the gift shop and seen how they made this very thin section into a scarf. Not for the reason that it represents such a really wonderful set of bone preservation, but because it's just intrinsically kind of fascinating. So now you know what that's all about. The little bright crystals here represent mineral that's being filtered through, and the passages where blood vessels used to be, but it's really well preserved, and where all systems go with being able to do some very high quality dating and isotopic work with these samples. And we have started to do that. So there's smaller animals as well. We are very familiar with the teeth of the leaf-eared mouse, who evidently was living all over the cave site and had pretty free access to all of the levels of the cave that we've looked at so far. There's another little smaller mouse, the grass mouse, and here's one of its teeth. If we had more ability to work with this material in a with their genes, maybe we could get a little closer than this and maybe do some paleo-environmental work. We have someone who would be interested in collaborating with us on this, but in fact, it's really hard to just look at the teeth and tell exactly which species it is. We're just happy to see that we can see the activity and the productivity of the environment if there are no life, no mice. Now we next get to the next animal in the category, which is that Vizcacha. So it's an animal about the size of a cat. People eat them today. They're kind of cute and silly, but they are one of the largest prey animals that's easily available. So I really sweated a little bit about this. This is a pile of Vizcacha remains from one sample. You can see that some of them are burned and some of them are not burned. I didn't think that the burned ones had been used as food, but I needed to know more about the range of variation in how they'd gotten broken up like that, how many were whole bodies and how many were just little fragments. And if you look closely, this is actually a piece of a bead, a bone bead made out of a vicuña leg bone. So then we have to really think there's a lot going on. I did see that there were clear butchering marks on some of these Vizcacha bones. Here, these little scratches are, believe it or not, where someone took a stone tool and cut off the jawbone of the Vizcacha. This is a hip bone, and these cut marks here show where someone cut and then cracked the back end, which is the meaty end of these animals, before they evidently roasted it in the fire. So yes, some of these Vizcacha bones are the result of food, but some, based on how complete the skeletons are, how they're wads of these things with no cut marks, no burning. There were also Vizcacha living in the cave, and they were probably Vizcacha kicking around the back of the cave and mixing up the layers. So we had to be really, really careful with the relationship between Vizcacha and the people they were living around for the whole cave sequence. Then there is a lizard, and this is the only lizard at high altitude. There are no snakes. There's just this one little iguana relative, and it's very, very common in the deposit. You can see here's a little piece of crusty sediment where a whole little lizard is sort of curled up there, and those are all of his bones. It's about to be a little late Ice Age fossil. I thought I really owed it to these guys to see whether or not they had been used as food, and there is no evidence for them having been used as food. They probably were quite active during the wet season when it's just faintly warmer, but during the dry season when this would have been a very important place for people to come, they probably weren't, they were probably just under rocks, kind of hanging out. So then we get to the point of what people are doing with the bone. This is something that people are always, they think, why are you bent over your table identifying bone like this? What can you see? It's like, once you've gone beyond the fact that it's a bone, that it's a bone of a certain animal, and you can relate it to the shape of the animal, then you can start to see how people are working with the animals and using the animals to do what they need to do. And the extent to which that bone-related craft takes skill, is complicated, takes multiple other tools, tells us about the complexity of the social organization and the technological organization, tells us the kinds of tools that people would have carried with them to get here, and tells us what their sense of perfection and intention was. So this is just a really nice a bone tool that would have been used probably for basketry or working on some kinds of leather work. This is another little fragment of a needle. You don't bring a needle along if you're sewing. So this was, unless you're sewing. So this is a sign to me that they were sewing, they were tailoring clothing and repairing clothing as they went. You can imagine there's a cold environment. You'd want that little vicuña skin pair of pants with the vicuña fur on the inside. This is, it's hard to make out, and I'm going to ask you to take my word for it. This is a tiny piece. This is a single millimeter here. This is a cut edge of a long finger bone of a vizcacha. And someone sat there in the cave making a circular groove until it snapped into a little open section and made a bead that probably were able to fasten to their clothing or maybe put around their neck, decorated some other piece of craft work. This is really, doesn't talk about leisure, but it talks about the organization of time, so that one of the things people might be doing here is not just like hunting, munching, sleeping, and then moving on because you've run out of food, but you've got a whole realm of activities. And then when I saw this burned long bone shaft fragment, I just thought, oh my gosh, look at this. It's nothing much. It's someone, it's a bone that was being prepared, probably be made into another bone tool, which is cool itself, but you can see the individual strokes of the hand. It's really well preserved, and you can see someone cutting at low angle with a stone scraper, pulling off little tiny shaves of bone, getting just the size and shape of bone they wanted. And you can see them lifting up their hand like, that's it, I got it. The notion that we can see skill and intent and even learning here is very, for me, it's really evocative of whether or not these people were kind of on the edge of desperation because they were so cold, or whether they had really solved the environment and were using it in some very ways that are familiar to us, working on early hunters everywhere in the world. And we know that they were able to deal with the cold and the thin air and the plant scarce environment. So about those stone tools, I would be misrepresenting if I didn't think that people were fascinated with the stone tools from these cave sites. Some of them are made of obsidian because we're very close to obsidian sources in those volcanic hillsides. Some of them are made of imported, beautiful chert-like stone. And this piece might have come a long way. It's a very distinctive, well-known late Ice Age style. So this is my colleague Daniela Osorio with Kurt Rademacher, Taylor Wilson, and Emily Milton. And we are setting out all of the late Ice Age tools, trying to see what they had, what the toolkit looked like, how complicated it was, how many different sizes of tools there were. And then looking at the tiny samples, These are some tiny little flotation samples where I'm picking out different kinds of bone of different kinds of teeny animals, but oh my gosh, where did it? Okay, there's another, pretend that I didn't lose it. There's a beautiful, one of the things that Daniela did was that she sorted out the individual flakes from individual chips, forming these beautiful stone tools, and made piles of obsidian debitage, chert debitage. She saw which colors of stone had been resharpened and which colors of stone had been made, new tools had been made in this place, letting us see the whole mapping people's, I'm always interested in mapping people's use of the animal resources. She was able to map people's use of the stone resources that moved across the environment. Okay, so after that, after we had been so successful at Panaulauca that we felt we really had a lot to offer in terms of understanding ways that we could approach very old sites very respectively, our thoughts turned to the other really early high altitude site in Peru, which is the famous cave site of Lauricocha. Now, the cave site of Lauricocha has a series of burials in the bottom of the deepest level. Here's their stratigraphic sequence. Again, really nice, late prehistoric material. All of this stuff is when people are using ceramics and going back and forth to settled villages in another place. This material is the material in Lauricocha 2 is the late hunters and gatherers. And the stuff that really draws people's eyes is that we have human burials here that have been directly radiocarbon dated to 12,000 years ago. So this is another candidate for being one of the places where people came first and managed to settle in and make a living. So here's how excited we were. We saw that beautiful lake. We saw these mountains. You can see how excited I am. We're just dazzled when we get here. And we go to a meeting with our community, who we hope will be our future community partners, the director of the village, the person who has the bunch of tickets to get into the site. He had plenty of tickets, and this is a man who's kind of running a little boat launch operation on the lake. They were really excited to see us. This material, again, it's very high up, it's very cold, they're very far from a paved road, or though they do have electricity, it's really, it's made a real difference to them. And they all have cell phones and they're all on WhatsApp. And so we were able to forge connections that we can maintain over long distances and figure out what they want. You know, we said, well, we've done this booklet. They said, we like the booklet. We'd like to be able to have a booklet like that for us to show people. We'd like to have something for the school. Couldn't you make a little museum in the school? And several of us have had experience making community museums. We said, absolutely. And we thought about ways that we could do that in a way that would not threaten any of the precious cultural material. So what we think we're going to do is ask for permission to open up one of those early trenches, but it's a very complicated site. And I have one last video, so you'll see how much there is to think about and plan before we get to that point. So you see this big landscape of wetlands, and then this very prominent limestone ridge at a crazy angle. Now you're seeing the drone is homing in on the 3 separate shelters in this cave complex. And you can see the people for scale and the deepness and the softness and the messed up sediments. So again, this is all back dirt, and we'll be using some very careful techniques to identify where the edges of the old trenches are so that we don't have to excavate anything that hasn't already been excavated to get to one of these edges to pull samples out for our specialized dating, isotopic work, and environmental samples. So you can see I'm going to scuttle off here in the corner in this view. But it's, again, a very prominent location, would have been a famous place, easy to find in prehistoric times near this lake. We're really kind of in love with it as a way to compare to what we've said about the past. So one of the things that came our way in the past couple of years was one of our colleagues working on a similar site at slightly lower altitude, who became convinced that women were hunters. And it wasn't a big surprise to us, but this is Randy Haas, now of the University of Wyoming. And he said, I think that women were hunters here because in this early, just post-ice age, late Pleistocene period, we do find women with hunting kinds of equipment in their burials. This is what we think would have been an unanticipated way for people to think about how early hunters lived. And then they said, and you know what? There's a lot of red pigment around some of these burials. And the same thing is true of the burials at Cuncaicha as well. So we think they were rubbing the red pigment on their vicuña leather clothes. And so somehow the artist vision made this come out as a pink little outfit here. It shows you how many different elements of the prehistoric past you have to have together to be able to really think through what you're saying about how people would have lived on a landscape, what they would have looked like, and how they would have behaved towards one another and towards the land. We spent a lot of time when we were making our little book deciding whether or not children were part of this world. There are no burials of children, though there are multiple burials of grown-ups. It would have been a very tough place to have a kid, but when we saw how the kids lived there, walked out from the health center all the time to see us, how warm you could have been in the cave, how they had the tools to make tailored clothing, how they clearly were able to find fuel to keep warm, how they had ways to keep out of the wind, how they knew everything that they needed to about how to chase these animals, which they had been chasing the relatives with of all the way from Wyoming. We really kind of became ready to say that these were family groups. And I guess they were wearing pink. But we are very interested in the possibility that we are looking at people here who are not suffering, but are as content and productive, and in some ways as well suited to their environment. So I'm going to stop talking because I know I've raised some questions, and I want to just say a special thanks to the 2023 grad student team. Victoria Schwartz with the sunglasses on here was the one who took all that drone footage and provided it to me, and I really appreciate that generosity on her part.